Welcome to the EU International Ocean Governance Forum and to the launching webinar of the Thematic Working Group 1 on improving the international ocean governance framework. My name is Sebastian Unger. I'm Senior Fellow at TMG Think Tank for Sustainability and head of the Ocean Governance Research Group, and I will be the moderator for our today's webinar. I will be facilitating this group together with my colleagues Ben Boteler and Barbara Neumann, who will stay in the background to ensure a smooth running of this webinar today. Today on Earth Day, we have around 200 registered participants from all over Europe, from Africa and the other side of the Atlantic. And I assume during these difficult times of the global pandemic, you are also staying at home at your home places. The main focus of our webinar will be to present the IOG Forum, to clarify the focus of our thematic working group and to present to you a way forward to launching this working group. Of course, we had foreseen to have an in-person meeting to take place in Brussels, but we are now very pleased to have you all today with us to launch this work online. Our meeting today will have an opening. We will be very pleased to see very soon a video message by Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius for Environment, Ocean and Fisheries, to be followed by a message also delivered on video by Peter Thompson, UN Special Envoy for the Oceans. We then have the meeting to be continued by a statement by Veronika Feitz, who is the Director at the European Commission for International Ocean Governance. And I have the honor to present to you the working paper that we have prepared to kickstart the discussion in our working group. We then go straight into the substance, and for our working paper and this webinar, we have three key topics of importance for international ocean governance that we are going to address. That is the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and the 2030 Agenda. It is the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity, and it's the climate and ocean nexus. We will then close this meeting with some concluding words by our co-chairs, Eliseen Abba from the European External Action Service and Mark Richier from the European Commission. Let me now start with session one, which is our first delivery, our first contribution by the Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius. I wish you all the best by listening to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining our webinars on international ocean governance. I would have liked to welcome you in Brussels, but we must adapt to the situation. Of course, right now, the public health crisis is the most urgent challenge to address. But by holding this digital conference, we want to recall that our oceans cannot just wait until we get out of the crisis, and that we have a duty to keep the momentum of this super year for the Oceans 2020. What's more, by turning this major event on ocean governance into a virtual meeting, maybe we pave the way for a new, climate-friendly approach to international policymaking. Let's prove that it can be done by actively contributing to the discussions. Today's webinars are part of the EU's International Ocean Governance Forum. This forum unites stakeholders and experts within and beyond the EU, guiding the EU to ensure the conservation and the sustainable use of our oceans and seas worldwide. The ambitions are clear. More than 150 countries have adopted the 2030 Agenda, including SDG 14 on life below water. But with only 10 years to go, we need to scale up our efforts to achieve what we agreed to. First of all, we need to strengthen the international policy framework. This is a basic prerequisite. Some of the ongoing policy processes, such as the BBNJ negotiations or those on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, offer a unique window of opportunity. we have to grab it with both hands. Second, we need to accelerate progress on the ground, putting in practice what we preach. The challenge of climate change only exacerbates the existing pressures coming from marine pollution, unsustainable resource use, or illicit activities. At the same time, the blue economy offers opportunities for sustainable economic development. So I am convinced that we can restore our marine environment while also bringing benefits to our coastal communities and the economy at large. Third, we need to strengthen our knowledge about the oceans. The start of the UN Ocean Science Decade offers the opportunity to advance the role of science and knowledge in international ocean governance. And finally, we will also now have to look at the implications of the current crisis for ocean governance and the ocean's role in the post-COVID blue-green recovery. The objective of the forum, starting with your discussions today, is to turn these challenges and opportunities into recommendations to the High Representative and the European Commission. I'm looking forward to the results of your exchanges, and I invite you all to discuss them together at the meeting of the forum on 9th to 11th of December in Brussels, if all goes well. I wish you a constructive, fruitful, virtual debate.
Thanks a lot to the Commissioner for this really encouraging statement. And I'm now very pleased to announce that we have another video message by the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, one of the most outstanding champions for ocean sustainability in SDG 14 that you all know, Ambassador Peter Thompson. So I invite you to receive his video message.
Warm greetings, colleagues, friends, fellow ocean activists gathered in cyberspace for the International Ocean Governance Forum. Through all the trauma and sadness of these dark pandemic times, we must have faith that our trials will soon be over. And when they are, that we will find ourselves stepping out on the roads of recovery. Already we can see the crossroads ahead, so it's time that we fortify our resolve to take the high road that leads to a sustainable world. Humanity must not stumble back onto the temptingly low one, returning us to profligate burning of fossil fuels, planet-polluting single-use plastics, and wanton denigration of nature. The self-interest of our species demands that unprecedented reductions in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions around the world must be central to our building back better. Only then will we reverse the decline of the ocean's health and best secure our own. The high road to a sustainable world is the blue-green recovery road, the one that brings human and natural systems back into a harmony that is based on respect and balance. This must surely be the hallmark of the UN's BBNJ Ocean Treaty Conference and the CBD's post-2020 framework, moving, for instance, to a world in which at least 30% of the ocean is protected under effective and well-managed conservation measures. The blue-green recovery road has faith in the genius of our species, our powers of innovation, and our ability to share ideas and resources. Dear colleagues, as you commence your discussions today, please do so in the knowledge that you are contributing to the positive momentum of SDG 14's implementation. Yes, the super year has been disrupted, and all our key conferences have been postponed. But no more than that. They will be held, and in the meantime, we have a responsibility to maintain the momentum and meet the targets set by international agreement. I give us examples. SDG 14.5's demand that we conserve 10% of coastal and marine areas by 2020. And SDG 14.6's demand that we eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies before the end of this year. These targets are enticingly within reach, so let us renew all available efforts to achieve them. Dear colleagues, gathered here in the virtual space of the International Ocean Governance Forum, we know the ocean will look after our needs as long as we treat it with respect. To do so, whether within our EEZs or out on the high seas, we must apply the best of our governance abilities through science-based planning and diligent management processes. Hopefully, it will not take another pandemic to drive home the message that we're all in this together, that Homo sapiens has only one planet on which to live, and that we must govern our place upon it with greater skill and diligence, a goal that is clearly only going to be achievable through regional and multilateral cooperation. So more power to you all in your deliberations at this timely forum. I thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador. We are really delighted to have received this encouraging statement for our work here in the IOG Forum. And then I'm now delighted to hand over to our colleagues from the European Commission to explain in a nutshell what the International Ocean Governance Forum is about. This talk was foreseen for the director of DG Mare, responsible for international ocean governance, Veronika Feitz, but just learned that she might be replaced by Mr. Raphael Goulet, head of unit in the very same Director General.
Thank you, Sebastian, and I hope I am on. So I would like to say good afternoon to everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to welcome you also from the side of the European Commission to the first International Ocean Governance Forum, which unfortunately has to take place in a different format than initially foreseen. In view of the circumstances created by the coronavirus epidemic, we decided to convert the physical meetings into webinars to allow the stakeholder forum for the future of our oceans to commence work. I'm really glad to see that so many have followed our invitation, regardless of the changing format. And I do hope that everybody is well connected and can see and hear me and follow the rest of the webinars. To start with, let me explain why we organized this forum. And I would like to see the second slide on now. The establishment of a stakeholder forum dedicated to oceans and seas worldwide is based on the joint communication on international ocean governance adopted by the Commission and the European External Action Service in 2016. This communication identifies 3 strategic priorities for safe, secure, clean and sustainably used oceans, and hence for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 14. These priorities are improving the international ocean governance framework, reducing pressures and facilitating sustainable blue economy, strengthening international ocean research and data. It identifies 50 actions to achieve these objectives. The Stakeholder Forum for International Ocean Governance is one of those actions. And we move to the second slide, please. This forum today and the next 3 days builds on the achievements of the European Union's international ocean governance policy over recent years. The first progress report on the implementation of this plan of action for the future of our oceans shows that we are well on track in implementing our policy. Oceans are increasingly on the international agenda. There is growing recognition that clean, healthy and productive oceans and seas are key for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And there is growing recognition that clean, healthy and productive oceans and seas are a prerequisite for a sustainable blue economy. This is even more true in times where we have to prepare for a blue, a green, a sustainable recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. It is evident that we need to upscale our efforts to strengthen ocean governance and its implementation to ensure clean, healthy and productive oceans and seas for the future. This brings me to the next slide. EU member states share the view that more needs to be done. And as you can see on the slide, on their council conclusions, on the council conclusions of the member states on oceans and seas of last November, they are very much on the same line. These conclusions welcome also the establishment of the Stakeholder Forum and support the follow-up and further developments of the European Union's ocean governance agenda. So what's the scope and the objectives of the forum? And the last slide gives you an overview of that. With this forum, we want to provide an open and transparent platform for stakeholders within Europe and beyond to share understanding, to share experiences, and to share good practice. We want to get good ideas for further actions to tackle the global challenge of ocean sustainability. Discussions in this forum will feed in our own reflections on how to step up ocean governance and to deliver on our sustainability objectives at the European level, as laid down in the European Green Deal, and as at the global scale, notably as set by the Sustainable Development Agenda for 2030. The forum has 3 thematic working groups based on the 3 priorities of our international ocean governance agenda that you saw on the first slide. There are some horizontal topics, such as climate change, which will be discussed in each of the 3 groups. This should allow to consider them under different angles. The same is true for enabling factors, like capacity building or funding, in light of their transversal relevance. Results from discussions in the 3 groups will be brought together to feed into the further discussions. So now let me turn to today's webinar. Today's thematic working group 1 will be dedicated to improving the international ocean governance framework. Several key processes, such as the BBNJ negotiations or the preparation of the post-2020 framework on biodiversity, are underway. On the other hand, agreed targets, such as the targets under such as the 2020 targets under the Sustainable Development Goals 14, are at risk to be missed. The EU is fully engaged in these processes to ensure the successful conclusion and delivery. Many questions need, however, to be addressed in the context of this afternoon for how we can improve international ocean governance. How can we ensure these processes work effectively together towards ensuring sustainable oceans? How can we accelerate the implementation? Which role for global versus regional versus national frameworks and actors? These are just some of the questions that you will consider today, and we are really looking forward towards your reactions. I will not go further into detail at this stage and leave the more detailed presentations of the discussion paper to Sebastian. For now, I wish you a very good session, and we are really very much looking forward to the results. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, dear Veronica, for outlining this very ambitious and timely agenda of the European Union and for inviting us all to contribute to this important work. I'm now very happy to be able to introduce to you the discussion paper that provides the basis for our working group. And you all have received this paper beforehand. And I hope that you found those questions and those issues raised in the document pertinent to starting the discussion of this working group. At the end of the session, we will have a short opportunity to enter a first round of questions that you might have. And I wanted to remind you that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window where you can ask question to all of us. So when we look at our working group, the starting point for our work is about ocean governance, and we understand this to be about the managing and the use of the ocean to keep it healthy, productive, safe, secure, and resilient. We have a joint understanding that the international ocean governance framework need to be strengthened to better deal with the challenges the ocean is faced with. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the current existing ocean governance framework set up to deal with the ocean. Taking forward one of the 3 key issues of the joint communication, which is the on the international ocean governance agenda for the future of our oceans, is the key objective for our working group. Our discussion paper focuses on challenges and opportunities in the international ocean governance process and raises key questions for the discussion. Our focus is on the Sustainable Development Goal SDG 14 and other ocean-related SDGs, as Veronica has just mentioned, and about marine biological diversity and establishing MPA networks. The third topic is on the ocean and climate nexus. Our discussion paper, of course, is not aiming at providing a comprehensive and all-inclusive picture, but it's rather meant to be a starting point and will be further developed in the work of our working group. When looking at the ocean governance framework, we have to consider what are the key challenges in international ocean governance. And this is the increasing cumulative pressure on the ocean. These are the compounding effects due to the increases in greenhouse gas emissions. These are new and emerging activities such as deep seabed mining or possible marine geoengineering. And when we look at those challenges and these issues, we can see, and science is very clear on that the effect on the ocean is detrimental. And these challenges are faced by a governance systems that has regulatory and implementation gaps and weaknesses, and that is fragmented. And we all know that at the moment, new uncertainties will be added by the COVID-19 pandemic that the international ocean governance framework will have to deal with once the urgent relief is over. In our working group, we want to focus on opportunities for improving international ocean governance, and we are focusing the discussion on the current processes that provide the opportunity to strengthen the existing framework. And this is most notably at the moment the Sustainable Development Agenda and SDG 14, as well as other linked ocean-related SDGs. We see particularly an opportunity to leveraging interlinkages in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and interconnectedness between the different SDGs. There's a strong need to accelerate progress in reaching SDG 14 targets, for example, by developing more robust pledge and review systems for voluntary commitments. And also more coordinated implementation, follow-up and review at all levels, including at the regional level, is needed. Of course, we have to realize that this year, most likely 4 targets of SDG 14 will be missed, and we have to find a way how to develop guidance for dealing with those targets in the post-2020 period. The opportunities for improving international ocean governance are, of course, very clear also in the field of conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. But this is also where the need is perhaps the biggest. But there are major processes ongoing. We have the negotiations for legally binding instruments for the conservation and sustainable use of BVNJ. And we have the discussion under the roof of the Convention on Biological Diversity on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. A key tool developed under both, or to be developed under both, are area-based management tools, including marine protected area networks, particularly development of area-based networks. But we have suggestions in the context of the CBD of protecting 30% of the ocean as MPA, but we also have to look what is happening outside the MPA. So how can we realize ecosystem-based management and sustainable use outside of MPAs? The third topic that we are looking at is the climate and ocean nexus. And whilst at the moment we are seeing the coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, that really reminds us that the ocean is a victim of climate change. The ocean also has a great potential for mitigation, for adaptation and building of resilience. And key process that we need to to look at in this context is the ocean and climate nexus and the related discussion under the Paris Agreement. We have to look at how ocean-based measures can be featured in nationally determined contributions and how the ocean dialogue planned for the next SubStar meeting and the forthcoming COP26 can be used to keep the ocean-related discussion really on the top of the climate agenda. So we now have a short opportunity to address questions that we have received, and we have already got a few. One, for example, by Takehiro Nakamura, who is working with the UN Environment Programme and coordinating the regional seas activities there, who ask if there's also the ongoing work on chemicals for the post-2020 agenda to be discussed in this framework, and whether it's possible to link this to our debate. We haven't, Takehiro, we haven't so far taken this up in the discussion here, but there are also, and I haven't mentioned this in the beginning, in the introduction of our webinar, there are two more working groups, one looking at pressures and another one on science and policy interfaces. And these will be issues that can be addressed also in the context of those working groups, but we take this into account. And of course, another question that we just got while we are here by Rémi Parmentier is that the SDG 14 targets, of course, not all of them, it's not clear those that mature this year that will be missed, but there's still, of course, ongoing discussion, particularly the discussion on the fisheries subsidies, and there's strong hope that this target will be achievable. But this, of course, really depends on action, as he outlines. David Johnson from the Gobi Secretariat reminds us that ecosystem restoration should feature strongly too, and this is certainly an issue that could feature also in the discussion with regard to ecosystem-based management outside marine protected areas. So I'm really, really happy that we are getting more and more questions, and while we have to slowly move on to our next topic, I really would like to assure you that nothing will be lost. We will have a recording of all the questions. We will really take them into account in the further development of our working group plans. Now, moving to the questions that are related to our key topics, and I'm really happy that we're now entering the substance of our working group, and that is on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and SDG 14. And we will have as our first keynote speaker, David Ubura. David is the founding director of Cordio East Africa. David has a long track record in coral reef research in Eastern Africa. And now he's one of the leading figures in the discussion on SDG 14, doing a lot of research in the context of the West Indian Ocean. They are also very much focusing on the question of the blue economy. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and good afternoon, morning, evening to everybody in the webinar. I feel a bit like an inaugural speaker, as this is my first of these COVID remote seminars, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more of them. So my task is to talk about the SDGs and Agenda 2030 as an opportunity for regional ocean governance. And I think I don't really need to introduce the Sustainable Development Goals, because most people on this webinar will be very familiar with them. What I will do is go through some of the key points from the background paper that Sebastian introduced, and also from a perspective that I've been developing to try and break away from the very, I think this is, once my first slide comes up, this is the rectilinear, very square model of the SDGs that we started with back in 2015. But of course, they are indivisible, and there's been a lot of work to really work on the synergies across and between them with more holistic approaches such as the circular diagram and leading to the interactions work. Some people on this webinar have been involved with studying. The Stockholm Resilience Center prepared the figure on the right, really emphasizing the biosphere as the support for the sustainable development and society and economy buckets as well. And the central figure is the one that I've sort of developed and we'll go into a little bit later, but really emphasizing the 3 pillars for sustainable development and how the SDGs package amongst those. First, looking at how they can really enable a regional approach. I think one that is key is that they cannot be achieved in isolation. We need to look at all the SDGs together. And this really pushes us to consider co-benefits, win-win situations across linked goals, but also to watch out for antagonisms and negative interactions amongst the goals. The other thing that is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive in doing this is that while the SDGs are really a global framework, the interactions amongst the goals are so context dependent that you have to look at each individual and local situation to really understand what their interactions are. And I think that's a very strong benefit that we need to capitalize on more. They can break down fragmented governance because they are explicitly multi-sectoral, particularly at ocean and regional scales. And the other way that they can really help in the regional approach is looking at progress reporting on the SDGs because of the formal indicator mechanisms, but also in terms of voluntary commitments. And I'll come back to that in more informal processes towards the end. There is, of course, some lack of progress, as Sebastian mentioned, towards some of the targets. And how do we deal with flexible and difficult timelines with dealing with the goals? And what I'll do is just I'll approach this briefly for the few minutes that I have from an example. So looking at a coral reef fishery, both in terms of monitoring and measurements of performance, the fishery sector is already very advanced in measuring fish catch, the number of fishermen, income and valuation and related to fishing. But we need a more holistic approach. The ecosystem approach to fisheries is also very well established now and promoted by the FAO. In this case, we can look at reef health and how that supports the direct benefits from fishing. But the SDGs allow us to have a much more structured approach to looking at indirect benefits or co-benefits in SDG language, perhaps. So reducing hunger, improving health, reducing poverty, aspects of inequality and gender as well, and then also sustainable coastal settlements. There's also the key aspects, the contextual and enabling factors or disabling ones, as it may be, from the environment, so climate, water and pollution impacts, and also the health of terrestrial vegetation and coastal influences on the sea in this case. And then I think just as important is the framing of the means of implementation within the same package of goals. So in order to really achieve sustainable fisheries in this whole package, we do need knowledge and education. We need good governance and management, and we need funding and support and participation from all actors who are involved. And the key thing here is that if you can build a model like this around the SDGs for looking at one activity or one sector, of course you can do it for any other activity or SDGs in looking at any one perspective to all of the others. Help support building regional ocean governance from many local and national contexts. The last slide really just summarizes some of the points that I had highlighted there, which is that the idea of this model is to really show that natural capital, economy, and society are really the 3 equal pillars of sustainable development. And then the governance and means of implementation are a 4th pillar that we have to address. The narratives that you can build from any of the 1 goals need a common framework in order to build consensus and complementarity. And this is particularly important when you're dealing with multiple countries and then also partners who may have different backgrounds. But of course, if they've adopted the SDGs, then should at least be heading towards the same vision. You can build coherent models for identifying key interactions, dependencies, and trade-offs amongst multiple sectors. And I think the key thing here is that in looking away from, say, just to focus on natural capital, which of course is what I would do as an ecologist or a conservation environmentalist, you can have a very human dimension, building theories of change for changing behavior of actors and evaluating outcomes, including for voluntary commitment. So not just at national levels, but also for any actor within the matrix. And then at a more simple level, as I showed in the example on coral reef fisheries, is you can build a checklist or matrices with indicators for planning, monitoring, and assessment, so we can fully assess how well we're doing in a coherent framework. So thank you. I think I'll end there.
Thank you so much, David, for this really interesting statement. And we are now coming to comments on the same topic by Karina Bakwe and Gerald Singh. Karina, she is a senior researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Gerald, he's at the Memorial University in Newfoundland, and both are renowned experts on the SDGs, particularly on SDG interlinkages, so very much also in line with David's comments here, and have a focus on the ocean, quite obviously. But before starting with those comments, let us briefly remember what the questions are with regard to the SDGs that we have highlighted in our background paper. And those questions are now here up on the screen, and the aim for today's meeting is not really to answer those questions, but rather to validate them, to review them and see if the scoping is right, and if this really gives the right direction for the further discussion in this working group with regard to the 2030 agenda. Please, as you are already getting familiar, use the Q&A function that will allow us to pick out questions and that we can then fire back to our speaker and discussants. But please also remember to use your full name. That will then also allow us to announce the questions to the speakers. So now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Karina Bakwe for her short commentary on this topic.
Thanks, Sebastian. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for this excellent work you've done with the report, and David for the very comprehensive introduction despite the short time. So rather than addressing each and every question, I think I'll just say some general comments. Obviously, the questions posed here are the questions of our time, so to speak. I think, as David highlighted, the real trick here is the means of implementation, the how to. We know where the problems lie. We know there's a lack of coherence and linkages. So how to get them to work? I can't promise to have the answer. So what I'm just going to share are our own experiences working with Agenda 2030, specifically with water and ocean related issues. And the starting point is, I'm not an ocean scientist. I am working very much in the integration between ocean and land. And for me, the ocean is usually seen as the outlet of all human activities. And so therefore, many of the answers to resolve the problems related particularly to marine pollution are in land. And this requires a systemic understanding of a complete different magnitude than what we're used to deal with, as well as the inclusion of a very broad set of actors beyond marine science and marine policy. And so increasing this connection between land and ocean-based activities would also make it possible to improve the connections between ocean-related SDGs and other targets. Maybe 4 ideas or approaches on how we could do this based on my own experience. There's many more out there for sure. One is better connection between spatial planning, particularly in coasts, and marine spatial planning, including designing and monitoring land-based activities that account for impacts on the ocean, not just impacts on the ocean and not just on the nearby surroundings. This can also improve how we build coasts that are more resilient and better prepared for what the report highlights as compounding and cascading effects from climate change. A second approach is circular approaches that close loops by changing production patterns, especially in food, industry, and utility services. I think this is perhaps one of the most important measures that we can take to limit polluting flows into the ocean. And so increase understanding and networking with the actors from these areas should be strengthened. A third is a need for capacity building, which the report also highlights, particularly around systemic decision making. Our experiences when supporting countries in Asia and Latin America and Europe is that the implementation of Agenda 2030 is that context-based system thinking is crucial, as David pointed out, but is also poorly understood. And this is crucial to build an evidence-based decision-making process, particularly for the ocean, where a lot of the sins are more easily hidden and where understanding a priori the potential impacts becomes even more important because we might not so easily detect them. So increasing understanding of systems thinking is very important. And a last aspect is that we need to increase the monetizing, not just of the costs from solutions, but also monetizing the benefits and the co-benefits from the ocean, as well as the benefits from the measures to protect and sustainably use the ocean. And these need to be mainstream into policy and planning. And for this, I think research needs to develop better appraisal tools, more user-friendly tools that can be widely used and that provide a fair picture of the real costs from no action. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karina, for this really interesting and quite complimentary statement. I think this really takes us further, and I'm now very pleased to hand over to Gerald to give us his commentary on the same topic.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thanks, Karina and David, both very interesting statements. And I'm happy that the SDG interlinkage side of things is being picked up here. Indeed, I think over the past few years, it's determining how SDGs are interlinked. There's been a lot of scientific endeavors, multiple different ways of viewing it and assessing these interlinkages over the past few years. And the SDG interlinkages have been identified as one of the key themes for the UN Ocean Conference interactive dialogue. So I think there's definitely demand for it going forward as well. But I'll kind of limit my statements here, just given time restraints. And I'll first start by saying the interlinkage work is great, and I think it's really progressed. But I think the interlinkage work alone, the assessments on their own, really don't clarify much regarding what to do about the kind of resulting clarity, or complexity, I should say. What they show is that we're in a very complex world and we're dealing with complex topics, and alone they don't actually provide much clarity about what to do about it. But I think if we try to pair these interlinkage assessments with frameworks taken from more planning and policy schools, we can pair interlinkage assessments with planning tools on institutional frameworks and kind of see how our governance systems kind of need to scale in order to deal with the scale of the issue of SDGs. And so I guess one kind of proposal that I've been working with in some contexts that I think has some promise is to use an interlinkage assessment to align institutions and policies towards progress and try to align these different policies and institutions so that we're trying our best to promote ocean sustainability and trying to prevent different institutions from counteracting each other. So I guess the way I've been looking at it is that if you have set ocean priorities, you conduct an SDG interlinkage assessment to see how SDG areas support or detract from those priorities. And if you understand that, you can then try to match up kind of institutional networks to see how different governance institutions have to actually be structured, how they have to work together to prevent that kind of derailment I talked about earlier, and promote kind of synergistic effects between governance institutions. So what you have in the end are kind of a structural map of how governance institutions almost need to be set up to support these ocean priorities, especially in a context where most ocean governance thus far is very siloed and disconnected. So I would use that as kind of a proposal for thinking about possible approaches to address interlinkages to promote SDGs.
Thanks a lot, and Gerald, for these interesting additions to what we heard. And I think this whole topic of interlinkages that you all three touched upon is really one of the key opportunities for the UN Ocean Conference. And it has been said before that there is this dialogue planned on SDG interactions. So this working group also can hopefully contribute quite a lot of thinking to the further development of these interlinkages and interfaces and how to deal with those in the implementation. And this is also part of the questions that we have received so far. Thank you so much to all the really interesting questions that are coming in. We have one, for example, by Rico Vayupuro. And I think he very much raises this point that this work on assessing interlinkages is really important. But the question is now, how can we really move to addressing those in the implementation process? And I would like to perhaps also invite our three panelists. Please leave your cameras switched on. We are now in a discussion situation, so you're most welcome to come back. Gerald, please, what is your view? I mean, you have been working so long on really analyzing interlinkages from a scientific perspective, but how do you see really the possibility to close the gap from these analyses to really addressing those interlinkages in practice?
Thanks for that question. It's a difficult one for sure. I think we have to be a little bit more, I think, agnostic with regards to the general structure of SDG interlinkages. I did like how David Obura started by talking about how there's different kind of views and visions and goals with SDGs. I think for a long time, a lot of the focus has been on kind of the environmental underpinning of a lot of different aspects of sustainable development goals. But I think if you take the lens of, okay, we're focused on implementation, and how do you do it? It's actually very difficult to start from an environmental base, because we almost never directly affect that. We act through our institutions. And so now you have to kind of switch perspectives and think about, okay, what about an institutional base and how that needs to build up and affect the environment? And so I think if we take a SDG interlinkage framework specifically from the context of process in terms of what do we need to do to get where we need to go, and do an assessment that way. So thinking about being very clear, whichever policy body you're working with, thinking about what are the priorities they're trying to achieve and what does it take to get there, doing an interlinkage assessment there. And again, I think these interlinkage assessments really need to be paired with kind of institutional design and institutional structure to almost lay out a roadmap of saying, this is the structure of the institutions that are going to be implementing the plans, that are going to be promoting the strategies. So I really think it needs to kind of follow in that kind of route.
Thanks a lot, Gerald, for this clarification. I think this point also came out in your comment that we really have to move now beyond the mere diagnosis of those interlinkages. Certainly a key topic for our debate. David, we got a question from colleagues again at UNEP, and they point to the important role that particularly marine regions can play in providing a framework for addressing the SDGs. And it's really also to the heart of your research to see how the Western Indian Ocean is really dealing with the challenge of implementing the SDGs. What do you think, how can the regional approach best come in implementing and helping to implement the SDGs across the different targets for the ocean as a whole?
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian and Takahiro, for the question. I mean, I think, so formally, the regions need to assist the countries to report on their SDGs and to improve performance on the SDGs, because that's where the formal reporting and assessment happens. But I think if you go a level deeper than that, there's a lot of facilitation that regions can provide, because many countries either have low capacity or expertise in certain areas. And because of the need for coherence and consistency among countries within a regional context, providing guidance on standard measures and practices, variables, limits, and so on, can assist a lot. So I think that's a key role for the regions there. And if I can just touch on Gerald's answer just now, I liked it very much. And I think it's, in essence, the SDGs enable us to look at people's interests. And that's where you have to come back to in the end. So a business, for example, is in SDG 8 to make money and be a sustainable business. They do need to make a profit. But the caveat is that with the SDGs is that you need to look at the integers and not undermine any other goal or the capital that is the basis of any of the other goals, whether it's health or rights or the environment. I think that really enables looking at what the limits are to the frameworks and to the levels that different actors can go to within the SDG framework.
Thanks a lot, David. And we got another really good number of questions. Unfortunately, we can't go to all of them, but let me please pick one by Jake Rice from Canada. He highlights the particularly important interlinkage between the ocean SDG and SDG 2 on global food security, which is of course a key issue that is sometime, I wouldn't say forgotten, but it's not so much in the focus, and we're talking about SDG 14. How do you see that coming in more prominently when it comes to also bridging the gaps between, let's say, fisheries management and conservation management?
If I answer that quickly, I would say then the case holders for those SDGs for food security for the oceans, I mean, that's FAO, and it would be UNEP for the oceans and other ocean agencies. So that discussion needs to happen between those two, but of course with the case holders for the other SDGs in terms of what else needs to happen in sustainable fisheries or in rights-based approaches and things like that in other SDG institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, David. And we have really also a number of questions from multiple participants on land-ocean interaction. I think very much, Karina, coming back to your points and underlining the importance of land-based pollution also to be addressed in this context. And you have done quite a lot of work in the Baltic on nutrient pollution. And perhaps could you perhaps from that perspective really see how can we move about making the governance discussion really tangible on the ground, and how can we address those issues that are out there since decades but haven't been addressed appropriately so far?
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, I think the link to food is crucial. It's one of the largest contributors to eutrophication in the ocean. It is by far the largest, in fact, globally. And in oceans, like seas like the Baltic Sea, which are enclosed systems, that presents a serious problem. In terms of how to, I mean, I think we're all trying to address that, but some regions present some progress that I think we can learn from. In terms of HELCOM, which is a regulating body in the Baltic Sea, what we've seen is that there's been a decrease in eutrophication levels from food production, but it still remains high. And one big, let's say, issue that has been brought up in recent years is that most of the frameworks for reducing eutrophication are geared towards prohibition, regulation, prohibition, and stopping flows. And this creates an environment of don'ts instead of do's. And so this is where I think the circular economy, the EU circular economy package, the new farm to fork strategy comes into play, because it opens up opportunities for innovation, for business, and it includes a much broader set of actors in a completely different way. It's not just about don'ts, it's also about do's. And in that way, I think there's a lot of untapped opportunities for recovering, for closing cycles, and so on. And in that way, change our traditional linear production and consumption patterns towards more circular. So I think it's key to see things differently, to stop seeing the ocean as the outlet of everything we do, and instead see the circularity in the system.
Thanks a lot, Karina, for those really eloquent points on that. I would like also to share one really interesting comment that we have received from Alexandre Rodriguez. He is the Executive Secretary of the EU's Long Distance Fleet Advisory Council, and who highlights also that in this context, we really have to look at all impacts from human uses on the oceans, including also from deep seabed mining. And that whereas this concept of interlinkages might sound, this is not a point from him now, but from others, might sound a bit academic for some people, it really provides the basis also to turn the holistic agenda into a concrete governance outcome. But I guess this is really the challenge that we have to address in the work of this working group, that it really moves into practical implementation and concrete governance outcome. As said, no question will be lost. We have got so many exciting contributions from participants, but we will take them all into account and further revising our work. And as mentioned in the beginning, we will come back at the end of this webinar also about next steps and how this will all come together in the further work of this working group. Let me now swap to the second topic of our webinar, and please also invite our panelists and speakers for this topic to get ready. And it is a great pleasure to introduce to you, perhaps it's not really needed to introduce her, Christina Jurdy, who is the High Seas Special Advisor to the IUCN and also Assistant Professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. She's really one of the leading pioneers in the discussion on the whole question on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction and the process leading up to the negotiation of the legally binding instrument. And without further ado, I'm now handing over to Christina.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would say this is a bit intimidating, but I'm very excited that you're all here with me today to talk about this important topic of international ocean governance and the conservation sustainable use of marine biodiversity. We can only hope to skim the surface today, but I'm hoping to sort of give you a brief introduction to the wonderful paper that we have, the Introduction to the Thematic Group, then dive into some ideas for considering how we might use resilience theory and approaches in thinking about actually how to improve the institutions that are managing the ocean that have the greatest impacts on marine biodiversity. How do we really turn the table towards conservation and ensure sustainable use? and then some potential first steps that I'm looking forward to discussing with you all in terms of later implementation. First, wanted to say happy Earth Day to everybody. 50 years ago, many good people tried to launch an environmental movement to save the planet. Unfortunately, 50 years hence, we still have a long ways to go. But depending how you look at it, we are 50% of the way there. And we still have time to turn things around. We're reading about ocean restoration, the pillars and wedges we need to put into place in order to save our ocean and to save our planet Earth. So I'm hoping to take you for a little ride on some thoughts that we might be able to do. As we've heard from Sebastian, we have many challenges in international ocean governance, of course, increasing cumulative pressures. I also am concerned about the uncertainties that are coming with those pressures. We don't know how we're going to react. Many of the feedback loops are not in our favor. The fragmented and gap-filled ocean governance framework is poorly equipped to deal with these uncertainties. The multiple knowledge gaps truly hinder our ability to respond individually as well as collectively. And the COVID-19 pandemic is truly increasing both the uncertainties as well as the inequities of the ability to act, to respond, and to benefit from new innovations. And then finally, that these challenges are not just a problem at the international level, but go all the way back to the national and the local and the regional levels. And that, as I will say, we really need to be able to strengthen capacities and understanding at all these levels if we're to improve the international ocean governance framework. I was quite taken by this quote. If we need to remind ourselves of the urgency for action, we just need to start conducting scientific research. What is out there? What is actually being impacted? So there's a new report on the ISS website about strengthening regional oceans governance. First step is to look at your ecological baselines. What is going on? What are your values? What are the threats? And then what are the potential responses? Because the urgency for action is really in many ways illustrated by this simple experiment model of how long does it take for a particle to flow from one end of the Indian Ocean to the coast of Africa. That's in many cases, it's less than a month. That we really do need to consider ourselves as one interconnected planet, and that what happens within national waters has ramifications for areas beyond national jurisdiction, and very much the other way around. This is a global problem that requires global as well as local and national solutions. So as many of you are aware, the opportunities that are in hand, at least at the global level, many are focused on this United Nations negotiations for a new treaty under the Law of the Sea Convention that is to address the conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. I hope you'll bear with me if I say BB&J, beyond biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It is truly a mouthful. We're looking at a package of issues as priorities to address, which are of course marine genetic resources and methods to better share their benefits on an equitable basis, and then conservation measures such as area-based management tools, including and with a focus on marine protected areas, but also environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments that are really important information tools that can enable informed and hopefully decision-making that ends up in sustainable activities. And then underpinning all of this is really mechanisms, with the need for improved mechanisms to build capacity, transfer traditional and innovative technologies to our partners in the developing world, so we can all contribute to a sustainable, equitable, and conserved ocean. And of course, the cross-cutting issues that are also pervading the table are what are the common principles that we can put into place to guide decision-making throughout all the array of institutions that have impacts on ocean governance and ocean health and ocean biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction? What's the ongoing platform for cooperation that we can create through this new institution? And of course, there are many other issues in terms of trying to get as many people on board as we can, concerns about undermining existing institutions. We were supposed to have our meeting in 23rd of March, which of course now is postponed without a new date proposed. So we are in many ways hanging in mid-air, But we truly do need to take this opportunity to keep up the momentum, keep moving forward. This has in many ways been a long and winding road. For many of us, it began in 2002 or 2001 in the tiny island of Vilm, where we've been building knowledge, building capacity, building awareness, urgency. Now we just need to build that common platform for understanding. And one of the ways that I'm trying to think of that can bring something new to the discussion is really looking outside the field of ocean governance and what are the latest in ideas for building resilience in the world of climate change, in the world of cities, in the world of farming. What are the principles that people are saying we need to have in place to sustain our social ecological systems in a time of rapid change? And sorry, this isn't clear. The fundamental one, of course, is maintaining diversity and redundancy. And I would suggest that this is as important in maintaining biological diversity, ecosystem functions, as it is in our institutional makeup. What we're seeing is promoting polycentric governance, many institutions doing what they do best, but also recognizing the inherent connectivities between these institutions, between the ocean, and the need to be mindful of one another's impacts on common interests in terms of ocean health, institutional resilience, ecological resilience. I could go on, and when there's more time, happy to talk about some of these, the way these other principles can apply. I've written an article with a colleague, that's Siddhar Shekhar Yadav, and we're hoping that can serve as a platform for further discussion. But in trying to wrap this up in terms of next steps that I'm hoping that this group can do, the Thematic Working Group, but also in partnership with the other two thematic working groups on ocean health, ocean impacts, and ocean data, is starting to look at what are some of the first steps towards implementation of this future treaty, of our SDGs, of the Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 framework. And coming from a legal background, you'll be surprised if I say the first thing we need to do is science. But having worked with science for the past 18 years, I truly believe that we need to take advantage of this increasing work towards integrated ecological assessments, where we can identify the biodiversity values, the threats, the outside pressures, and how these are going to change through space and time. We're now dealing in a four-dimensional ocean. It's not enough just to look at connectivities, but we need to look at how these are going to change, impacted by climate change, cumulative impacts, as well as human change itself. I see spatial planning and management as a core focus. Yes, we need to start on marine protected areas where we know we have threats, where we have conservation priorities. But through integrated ecological assessments, I would hope that we can also get to have everybody at the table to understand what their particular footprints are on marine biodiversity, how we can all contribute to lightening that footprint in the interest of building resilience, lessening uncertainties, and building cohesiveness. We can do that if we actually all share the data, the research, the technology that is coming out of both industry, sectoral organizations, as well as the academic institutions. There's so much richness there, but it, like ocean governance, is fragmented and needs to be brought together to be able to address the full realm of threats. Marine genetic resources, there's a webinar, another one on this coming Friday afternoon, Boston time, about ocean genome. And part of it is focused on the value of the new genomic tools for enhancing research, conservation, and management. Marine genetic resources are not just about the potential, hopefully, for a cure or vaccine for COVID-19, but also on the ground conservation management. How do you assess the health of an ecosystem? These are already being applied in coastal waters. How can we apply them in areas beyond national jurisdiction and build the capacity for all to really benefit from this? We will, of course, need sustained financial support. I'm not going to pause on that one, but just to put it out there. And then really to end with the plea for mechanisms to think through the resilience principles on how can we apply that to strengthen the institutions we have out there, to strengthen the institution we're hoping to build for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and really providing that platform for cooperation that respects the diversity of viewpoints, but also understands the underlying need for resilience in the time of uncertainty and the overarching good, public good of long-term ocean health, biodiversity, and ecosystem structure and function. So I will end there with a beautiful jelly that we know very little about, but to me it symbolizes the need to be moving forward, but aware of what is going around you. This is a creature that's perfectly adapted to living in a three-dimensional, four-dimensional fluid space that always needs to be aware of what is happening around it, needs to have that network of information brought in to make informed decision-making, even if it becomes instinctual. We need to get that level where our responses are practically automatic in terms of adjusting course to maintain the direction of ocean health and resilience. I'll end there, and thank you very much for your attention, and please feel free to contact me with my email for further questions and discussion. Thank you, as well as part of this group.
Thanks a lot, Christina, for this, as always, really exciting presentation, and also reminding us that we're talking about real organisms out there. But now, as before, we'll have again 2 invited comments, and the first one will be by Daniela Dies from the University of Strathclyde. She is a senior lecturer at the university, holds a PhD in law, and is deputy director of the One Ocean Hub at Strathclyde. And then we will have Ronan Long, who is professor and director at the Sasekhawa Global Ocean Institute at the World Maritime University, and really an outstanding expert with, I think, more than a dozen books on law of the sea and at least 100 or so peer-reviewed academic articles. So I'm really grateful to have you both here and to provide a short commentary on this topic. Daniela, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sebastian, and all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this important forum. All those questions that were highlighted in the working paper, I think they're very important questions. The only elements I'd like to add and to reflect a little bit further is in relation to questions 1, 3, and 5 concerning the role of the Convention on Biological Diversity and other frameworks in addressing these questions. For instance, we can draw from guidance already developed by the CBD, since all parties to the CBD are parties to UNCLOS and have been involved actively in the BBNJ negotiations. And the CBD, of course, applies, as you know, to components of biological diversity and to activities and processes within national jurisdiction, but it also applies to areas beyond national jurisdiction with respect to activities and processes. And COP decisions from the CBD as well as UN General Assembly resolutions have reaffirmed the supporting role of the CBD in assisting with scientific and technical inputs to the BBNJ process. So, for example, in the context of area-based management tools, Decision 9/20 that was adopted in 2008 provides scientific guidance for selecting areas to establish a representative network of NPAs, including in open ocean waters and deep sea habitats, and provides guidance on 4 initial steps to be considered in the development of these representative NPA networks, which include scientific identification of the initial set of areas important for biodiversity, such as ecologically or biologically significant marine areas or EBSAs and other areas as well. Development of biogeographic habitat or community classification systems, making use of qualitative, quantitative techniques to identify those sites and to assess the adequacy and viability of those sites. But further to that, of course, there are a number of scientific studies that Christiana pointed out that can assist with further implementation of that guidance as well. And I don't think that BBNJ needs to, just copy and paste, but can draw from those lessons learned. And in making use of this guidance and developing further guidance, the institutional framework under the BBNJ agreement and its relationship with other competent bodies that hold relevant data and management mandates is key to this discussion. So as Christina pointed out, for instance, BBNJ, if we have a scientific body, which would be good, could be tasked to advise the MPA network design in collaboration with other relevant bodies, academics, scientific networks. On the role of the ABNTs, area-based management tools, in contributing to MPA networks, design and objectives, I'd like to highlight the work also done by the CBD on other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, because I believe that they will continue to be relevant under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And some of us in this call have written about OECMs, and thanks for citing our paper in the working paper. But just to clarify that after that publication, the CBD COP14 has adopted a definition and criteria for OECMs in the context of H Target 11 that could be very helpful, I think, here as well, since these sites should contribute to the network connectivity, representativity, and in achieving biodiversity conservation objectives. Of course, need to be brief, but just briefly, the definition of OECMs under the CBD is a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity and associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. So in this sense, there is a pressing need to better understand ecosystem functions from a scientific point of view, I think, especially in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And as FAO moves ahead with the intention to develop guidance on the OECMs in the fisheries context, and other sectoral competent organizations may decide to do the same, a possible coordination mechanism or some sort of oversight under the BBNJ agreement for recognizing ABMTs other than MPAs as OECMs, sorry for the acronyms, all the acronyms, in accordance with the CBD criteria could be pursued, I think, and to ensure that those measures, even if sectorally developed, are coherent from a governance standpoint, since one of the criteria of the OECMs under the CBD is that they should be consistent with the ecosystem approach. And in this line, I'd like to finalize this statement with a few points on the ecosystem approach, which, of course, FAO has great guidelines on ecosystem approach to fisheries, and the CBD has also developed principles and guidelines, implementation guidelines for the ecosystem approach, which actually aligns, I think, a little bit, Christina, with the principles that you mentioned on resilience. So it would be good to reflect on that parallel there as well. And the implementation, and as we have seen in the case of regional seas organizations and regional fisheries management organizations, it's important to incorporate the ecosystem approach not only as a principle in the agreement and in the BBNJ agreement, but I think as part of the objective of the agreement and as an obligation, and to provide institutional arrangements that facilitates that implementation. And in this sense, perhaps it would be important to consider here more explicitly the types of institutional arrangements needed to fully operationalize the ecosystem approach on all ocean basins, and what type of relationship should be in place between the global and regional level. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Daniela. That was really an enormous run through and this really important issues, and thank you for that. And I'm now really happy to hand over to Ronan Long for his statement. Please, Ronan, you have the floor.
Sebastian, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Christina. I enjoyed your paper very much. I focused my intervention on 3 points, and I suppose the first point relates to regulatory issues, which is highlighted as one of the key questions. I think key question number 3. I think having listened very carefully both to the first session and the second session, a key issue is the issue of enforcement and compliance. And in this regard, it's absolutely essential that we develop a liability regime for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Now, there are examples of very good practice on how to do this, and I would cite 2. There's Annex 6 to the Protocol on the Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, and that offers certain modalities for moving forward. Likewise, there's the European Union's Liability Directive. Now, in order to do this, we need a legal basis in the BBNJ agreement. As it stands, there's no reference to liability. And I think that's going to be seen as one of the great gaps in relation to implementation in the future. I think by doing so, we could address and answer a question which David Johnson raised on the Q&A session, which is how do we address restoration obligations? Or how do we get to the resilience issues? And I think this will only arise in the context of putting accountability on those parties that use and damage the ocean. So that would be my first intervention, is the issue of liability and ocean resilience and ocean restoration. And there's a good opportunity to do that now in the context of the final session, or the fourth session of the intergovernmental process. My second point goes more generally to the issue of capacity building. And I think there are two issues here which are standing out. Firstly, there's the funding mechanism. And if you look at your questions, that relates to both questions 2 and questions 4. And I think it's high time that users of the deep ocean fund capacity building. To my knowledge, we have some good examples of that. For instance, under the implementation agreement for Part 11 of the Convention and under the Mining Code, this is an obligation put on mining entities in relation to the deep ocean. We should have similar obligations in relation to the funding of capacity building in relation to other users of the ocean. I think also it's high time that we had specific measures of gender empowerment of women scientists. There are 2 references to gender in the draft BBNJ agreement, but it's imperative that these 2 references are adopted in the agreement. I think this is key, and it has to be a cross-cutting strand of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And I'd probably finish with this, which is there is an opportunity now to align initiatives under the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development with the BBNJ agreement and with the implementation of a future agreement, but also with capacity building. So we need greater convergence in relation to multilateral processes, ones that deliver agreements such as the BBNJ agreement, but also ones which are science dependent, such as the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And of course, this goes to the broader question which was addressed in the first panel. It goes to the question of implementation of the 2030 agenda, and quite clearly to the implementation of our climate objectives. So it has to be underpinned by science, and the Decade of Ocean Science provides us with a great opportunity to ensure greater convergence. I'll leave it at that, Sebastian, but I will join the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, dear Ronan, for your crisp and sharp contribution. And Christina, perhaps a first question to you that was raised by Mary Roberts from Edinburgh University, who leads the Atlantic project there. And he highlights in his statement or in his question the importance of good science, and that we really need to understand the biodiversity, that we need to understand the value of it and the connectivity, and also and need to really have a better understanding where climate refugia could be established. My question to you is really, I mean, you're working so much with scientists also at the sort of interface between science and policy making. How do you see a way to strengthen the science policy phase? How can we make sure that the really good available science is taken much better into account in the work on high seas and biodiversity within national jurisdiction?
Well, as with everyone, I wish I had a magic bullet, but I think if that's part of the reason why I'm trying to frame this in the resilience issue, that was the increasing impacts of climate change are increasing the uncertainty that we're all operating under. Shipping needs to understand better the weather patterns. They need to understand where the waves are going. Fishing do need to understand, what is the state of the ocean? Where are the high productivity areas as they shift? What are the impacts of warming temperatures? And the ability to incorporate this vast amount of information that is coming from scientists, we need to get rid of those roadblocks and bottlenecks and to open up these sectoral institutions to science from outside, to independent science. Right now, you see problems I won't go into details, but we need to recognize this is everybody's problems, that we need to refine and improve the science institutions inside sectoral organizations. And as Danny said, I think we need a common science basis that can in part be provided by the Decade of Ocean Science, the UN regular process, but we need to embed these scientists from the outside into the sectoral organizations and vice versa. These people need to be part of the scientific research that is being done to understand the state of the ocean. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Christina. And we got another really good question from Robin Mahon, who is professor at the Universities of West Indies, and they in their work have established sort of conceptual model for how stakeholders can really interact and how the different competent authorities can interact when dealing in such a complicated multi-level governance that we have in the oceans. And he's wondering how such models could perhaps even be applied at the global level, and whether it's possible to use such an approach to help stakeholders, to help governance bodies to better find their way in this context. And I don't know, Ronan, if you if you have a view on that, that would be, I think, a quite interesting question to be discussed.
Yeah, I think Robin is onto the key issue, which is stakeholder engagement, because unless there's engagement, you won't get accountability. And perhaps a problem with the treaty-based model is the obligations we're putting on states are not obligations borne by stakeholders in practice. So engagement with stakeholders through consultative bodies is a very important part of that. And you could argue that we should be looking very carefully at our treaty processes to ensure that there is a appropriate means for stakeholder engagement. And we've seen that in the context of the climate negotiations, that the stakeholders have been real actors in the process. I think it's, in terms of developing a conceptual model at a global level, I'm not so sure will that deliver the types of results that we need to deliver. I think very, very much the issue for us is to ensure that stakeholders have their voice heard at the global level. And I think the development of the conceptual model is something we have to be very careful in studying, and such as within the CARICOM community. So for Robin, I don't have a direct answer to his question, but certainly stakeholder engagement is the sine qua non of effective accountability, enforcement and compliance. Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ronan. And you also partly answered other question, like, for example, by Richard Cronin, from chair of the OSPA Commission, who pointed really in the same direction, that accountability is the key problem, and that their NGOs play a very strong role. Daniela, I have a question to you. Many of our participants raised points on definitions of MPAs, of OECMs, of ABMTs, etc. And I think all this also, when we have this 30 by 30 goal in mind, is something that, of course, still needs a lot of discussion. What are we talking about when we talk about 30% protection? Is this just MPAs? Is it just other tools? How does it come together? How do you, you studied a lot this discussion in the context of the CBD. I mean, how do you see this debate now taking shape also under the BBNJ agreement, where, of course, we talk about ABMTs, including MPAs, but on the other hand, there are difficulties to really cross the sectoral boundaries. And several respondents or several questions point to that fact. How do you see this going forward, and what is really needed?
Thanks, Sebastian. I think that those two processes, as I mentioned before, they're very complementary because I don't envision BB&J process establishing a specific target or in the treaty itself, because things can evolve. Of course, if we have conference of the parties, they might decide to have their own targets from time to time. But it needs, I think that the CBD, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will provide that target for states to pursue within and beyond national jurisdiction. The state of the negotiations at the moment, the latest draft includes there is that proposal of 30 by 30, and within that, MPAs are included in there, but also other effective area-based conservation measures are part of that mix as well. And this goes back to the negotiations of the Aichi Target 11 back in 2010 that, and sometimes that term OECNs is used interchangeably with conserved areas because it's an important issue also for indigenous peoples and local communities because they have different systems and sometimes they don't have protected areas per se, but they use other tools to protect those spaces. And that's how it emerged. And back in the day, in the Aichi 11, even 10% wasn't agreed upon to be, only solely encompassed by MPA. So in the discussion moving to a 30%, my personal view, I can't predict. It depends on the parties to the CBD. They're negotiating the target, but my own view is that it will continue that way, that if we move to 30 or if we move to another percentage, and protected areas will be part of the mix as well as other effective conservation measures. But area-based management tools are another category and that could also be used not only in the context of MPA networks, but in application of the ecosystem approach.
Mm. Thanks a lot, Daniela, for this short answer. And there are so many more important questions. There's a whole discussion going on now through our Q&A function. This will all be sort of stored and we will really make use of it. But we really have to move on now to our third topic. Thanks a lot to our speakers and panelists and for all these exciting and really constructive questions that we received from all our participants. So the third topic is on the climate and ocean nexus. So we really have to move on now to this really critical, coming here now last, but of course not least, important topic. And we are very, very happy that we have Jean-Pierre Gattuso with us today. He is professor at the Sorbonne University in Paris and works with ITRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris. And he's outstanding expert in this field, mostly also known for his work on ocean acidification, but much beyond also on the effects of the ocean, of the climate on the ocean. So without further ado, Jean-Pierre, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers to give me the chance to address this issue of the ocean climate nexus. In fact, the title of this presentation is both providing key messages and also the outline of the presentation. The ocean is an actor and a victim of climate change, but it is also a source of solutions. So this slide, probably several of you have already seen it, summarizes why we say that the ocean is an actor of climate change. It is because it absorbs a lot of heat coming from the extra greenhouse effect. 93% of the heat is stored in the ocean, which leads, of course, to warming of seawater and also to the loss of oxygen. The ocean also absorbs about 1/4 of CO2 emissions, leading to ocean acidification, and also the ocean is the main source of precipitation, water for precipitation, and also receives water coming out of the melting of ice caps and glaciers, leading with warming to sea level rise. So the ocean is also a victim of climate change, and this is a figure coming out of the IPCC special report on the ocean under climate change, chapter 5, and here we summarized the risks and impacts on marine and coastal ecosystems. You have here at the bottom left the legend for the color coding. So the risks of impacts and risks are shown as undetectable in white, moderate, high, or very high. These are the typical IPCC learning numbers. For a range of marine ecosystems and coastal ecosystems, and here you have the temperatures, the global, the mean surface temperature here, and here the global mean SST. And what this figure shows is that the risk is very high already in several systems. For example, the coral reefs, warm water coral reefs, the first number here. Already we are transitioning for high risk, as you all know, and the news from the Great Barrier Reef are not very good. And also for kelp forest and seagrass meadows, already at 2 degree global warming, they will start to transition into higher risk. So there is clearly, from a climate perspective, the ocean is a victim of climate change. So making the case for the ocean in the climate negotiations is relatively straightforward. So climate change already affects marine and coastal ecosystems and also the numerous services they provide. And we like to say that the Paris Agreement has the potential to avoid the unmanageable, but that we must also manage what is unavoidable, that is the changes to which we are committed. Therefore, the need for global mitigation and local adaptation is quite obvious, and the ocean provides solutions for both. So I'm not going into the details of those 18 potential ocean-based measures that are shown on this slide. Suffice it to say, we have looked at 4 categories. The first one are here measures which address the causes of climate change, measures that help support the biological and ecological adaptation, measures that enhance societal adaptation, and here solar radiation management. So those 18 potential measures have been assessed, and before I give you the assessment, I'd like to say that, as you know, as part of the UNFCCC mechanism, countries in 2015 were requested to make nationally determined contributions, their contribution to address climate change. And Natalia Gallo looked at 161 NDCs, and she found that 70% of those NDCs mentioned the ocean, 30% did not mention the ocean. For 21%, it's quite understandable. These are landlocked countries, but 9% of those missing ocean NDCs were from coastal countries, which is less obvious. What is obvious is that, in fact, most of the mentions of the NDCs are here in reference to impacts, so not really on mitigation and adaptation. And these are about mitigation and adaptation. And you see that the measures that are most cited is additional research, which is not really helpful in terms of UNFCCC mechanism. So in fact, quite few NDCs were proactive in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So there is a scope for increasing tremendously the usage of the ocean in those NDCs. So those measures are listed again here. Again, I don't have the time to go into the details. We have, the time is limited. Some of those, as I said before, NDCs measures address the causes of climate change, and others the impacts of climate change. So we clustered those measures into policy-relevant clusters. 4 clusters. The first one, the decisive cluster, these are the measures which should be implemented readily. They are available, they are well-known, they have good effectiveness, limited uncertainties, and a few disbenefits. Then there is the second category, low regret, which are already implemented. We know how to do that. Sometimes they have relatively low effectiveness, but they have a lot of co-benefits and few to none disbenefits. So these should also be implemented. Then there are the unproven measures, which are only at concept stage at the moment. They are potentially effective, and they potentially have low to moderate disbenefits. And finally, the risky clusters, these are also those measures are currently at concept stage. They are potentially effective, but they have also potentially very high disbenefits. And here you find the color coding on the slide. Again, I don't have the time. I'd be happy to answer questions. I'd like to refer you to this policy brief, this IDRI policy brief published last year on the opportunities for increasing ocean action in climate strategies. So the key messages of this policy brief is that the ocean obviously is a key element of our life support system and provide many services. There are actions in the ocean that can maintain and even increase those services despite climate change. The measures that we have assessed cover both mitigation and adaptation. 4 clusters: decisive, low regret, unproven, and risky. Advancing the knowledge on ocean-based solutions and actions is timely ahead of COP26 because this year countries are supposed to provide more ambitious nationally determined contributions. They need to be revised towards more ambitious versions. And we argue in this policy brief that ocean-based climate action should prioritize decisive and low-regret measures, improve the knowledge on the unproven one, and be cautious about the risky ones. So that was my last slide, but I added one slide to answer one of the questions on the Q&A. There was a comment from one of the participants that we shouldn't discuss the ocean climate nexus, but perhaps the ocean climate biodiversity nexus. I think this is very true. And I'd just like to mention this paper that we published 3 weeks ago, the 1st of April, Rebuilding Marine Life, where we identify climate change as a major roadblock to maintain and improve marine biodiversity. So there will be an IDRI seminar on this paper early June. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Pierre, and already sort of starting the discussion right away. This is really great, and certainly this will be a point that we are coming back to. But first, let's go to our discussants, and these are Joanna Post. She is the focal point on oceans and climate in the UNFCCC Secretariat and holds a PhD in environmental science. We then will listen to David Freestone. He's the Executive Secretary of the Sargasso Sea Commission, but also a Law of the Sea professor who teaches international law at the George Washington University, and also, for example, is the founding editor of the Journal of Marine and Coastal Law. So 2 really nice complementary perspectives on this what we call the ocean climate nexus. So without further ado, please also let us have a quick look again at the questions that we have outlined in our discussion paper that we put forward as a starting point of the debate, quite obviously. But now the floor is yours, Joanna.
Thank you, Sebastian. So thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Germany. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this discussion on improving the international ocean governance framework. As John Pierre highlighted in his presentation, the climate and ocean are one integrated system, and the IPCC and their special report on ocean and cryosphere on interchanging climate have highlighted the impacts and upcoming risks to the ocean and cryosphere, its flora and fauna, and of course the people that depend on it for their lives and livelihoods now and in the future. Multilateral action on climate change is coordinated under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and of course the Paris Agreement provides the legally binding international agreement for action. Ocean is a cross-cutting issue under the UNFCCC process, and I have the pleasure to be coordinating some of that work and be the focal point at the Secretariat, working closely with also across the UN with the UN Oceans Group. And there's a particular focus under the Convention on the role of the ocean as a sink and reservoir of greenhouse gases, and of course in the Paris Agreement ensuring the integrity of ocean ecosystems. However, there's currently no coordinated approach to ocean action under the UNFCCC. It's dealt with in different places, but not really in a coordinated way. However, there's some very clear links in regards to protection of oceans and climate change. So it's vital, as we've heard already this afternoon, the response to climate change focuses on urgently bending the curve to reduce fossil fuel emissions to net zero by 2050. So as to limit further ocean temperature rise and acidification. Many goals under the SDG 14, particularly in regards to protection of ecosystems, responding to ocean acidification and increasing scientific knowledge are directly linked also to the action under the UNFCCC. And under the UNFCCC, of course, parties must, and the Paris Agreement parties must consider all opportunities for building and supporting ocean and coastal zone-related resilience based on the best available science to co-produce solutions. And there are modalities in which to do that. So under the Paris Agreement, parties provide their nationally determined contributions. This is the year 2020 is the year for those to be either renewed or updated. And parties are considering how to strengthen ocean action within those NDCs. We have very few so far this year, due obviously to a number of other issues going on globally. But there's certainly indication from some of the NDCs that there is a strengthening in terms of ocean-related action within the NDCs. There's also, of course, under our process, from the resilience point of view, countries, particularly least developed countries and other developing countries, are developing national adaptation plans, and many of those also have projects and resilience projects that are based either in the ocean, in the EEZs or the coastal zones. And also under the Paris Agreement, at the global scale, under the process, there's a mechanism for measuring long-term progress. And this is through the global stock take. And it's important to consider how, moving forward, oceans are integrated into that process in terms of taking stock and looking at collective action. Following the COP in Madrid last year, there was a mandate. This is the first time there's been a specific mandate on talking about oceans under the UNFCCC, and there was a mandate for an ocean dialogue, which Sebastian mentioned earlier. This will take place at SB 52, which currently has been postponed until October, but it is planned for October this year, from the 4th to the 12th of October, and the ocean dialogue will take place during that time, and it will look at how to strengthen mitigation and adaptation action on the ocean and climate change, and that we have had about 40 submissions from parties and non-parties providing their views on what should be considered at that dialogue. And then also Sebastian asked me to talk a little bit about looking forward, and I think there's a number of areas to consider as we look forward with how to work together and synergize our work moving forward. In terms of parties' work on strengthening action at national and regional level, is particularly important to recognize the role of oceans as nationally determined contributions, but also how to support the means of implementation to implement that work. How do we synergize and support ocean-related research, systematic observation, finance, capacity building, technology transfer? How can these be strengthened, particularly for small island states and the least developed countries? How can the UNFCCC process be strengthened? Some suggestions we've had in submissions for the dialogue is to think about how we can introduce a regular ocean dialogue under the process, or how we can talk about a more unified consideration of ocean under the process. And of course, obviously, this should be linked with other work under the UN and more widely. The UN Decade on Ocean Science, for example, is a particularly important consideration in this work moving forward. And then, of course, if you flip it around, how can those working on ocean issues be made more aware of climate change and facilitate activities and actions with this in mind? You know, climate change friendly MPAs, for example. We all know that species are moving as the oceans warm. And how do we sort of like increase even this awareness of this ocean and climate nexus? We need a more joined up approach at all levels, from across ministries to across sectors and across the UN. The UNFCCC is a national-led process, it's a party-driven process, but how does that then translate to issues in regions, issues beyond national jurisdiction that are also vital to be addressed in a comprehensive, holistic manner? So with that, I will end. I'll thank you for your attention. I look forward very much to working with the group further as we collaborate to protect our ocean. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joanna, for your really interesting contribution. And whereas you came, of course, from the Climate Secretariat side, now we come from the other side of the climate-ocean nexus, and we have an outstanding law of the sea expert with David Freestone. And so we are really looking forward now to have 2 slides from David to tell us a story about 2 cities called Montego Bay and Paris. David, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. And thanks for the really good sort of intro from Joanna. I think that's much of what she said is also is on my next slide. So perhaps I could have that next slide. So it's actually morning here in DC, but good afternoon to those of you in Europe, and congratulations to the team for putting this together. So I was born in the city that is where Charles Dickens lived, so hence my attraction to his titles, etc. So as we heard, Framework Convention already has some recognition of the importance of the oceans. We know the Paris Agreement includes this one phrase, ensuring integrity of ecosystems, including the oceans. But when I say that they're 2 cities, they are 2 regimes which have difficulty, as Joanna has already pointed, of actually meeting. It's 2 things that ships that pass in the night, if you like. But what they do have in common is that they are both directed primarily at states' parties. And we've already heard about the importance of other stakeholders and other players. And one of the criticisms of the Paris Agreement has been that it doesn't recognize the important role that non-state actors play in this whole, or both these processes. And the point about that, I would make that from a legal point of view, is that states only have jurisdiction over the activities of their nationals, over those parts of the oceans where they have sovereignty, such as in the territorial sea, or they have sovereign rights like in EZ. And so we've lost, APNJ is not in there at all. So when we're talking about nationally determined contributions, and that's already been looked at, and Jean-Pierre already looked at this analysis by Gallo, etc., of the NDCs, what we see is that there are references to the ocean, but they're all about activities that are within national maritime zones. So perhaps if we could go to the next slide. This is going to be a little bit small, I must say, but I was approached recently by very serious scientists who asked me who was responsible for producing the nationally determined contribution in relation to the oceans. And of course, the answer is no one. There is no such thing. There aren't any thematic NDCs, and by definition they are national ones. So is there a way in which, and this is just a brainstorm to actually help us perhaps link up and address some of these questions, not to answer them, but would an open ocean determined contribution provide incentives for more collaboration for regulated and sustainable mitigation activities in ABNJ, which aren't, by definition, can't be done by one state by themselves. So, for example, the examples would be refugia, the establishment of MPAs, but also other sort of activities that Jean-Pierre was very helpfully mentioning. Those are the sorts of things which we need perhaps to be thinking about being done at a joint level by groups of states, because they cannot be done in an area beyond national jurisdiction unilaterally. There has to be some collaboration, and they have to be regulated. I think we've learned some interesting lessons from the ocean fertilization activities, which were planned 5, 6, 7 years ago, now 10 years ago, which were brought within the regime of the London Convention. So there has to be some regulation of these activities, but the mitigation activities in the open ocean are actually could be an important extra element in enhancing ambition, possibly. So that's one of the things I was looking at. Who would it be that would do this? We have already got regional and sectoral organizations, the regional seas organizations, sectoral organizations like the RFMOs, maybe even Seabed Authority and the IMO. And of course, the BBNJ agreement, the draft, already talks about legal frameworks, it envisages new legal frameworks and treaties. So that could be also a framework for putting together joint proposals or joint projects of that kind. Is this an issue for the UNFCCC? Yes, I think so. They're discussing a number of issues. It was interesting what Joanna was saying about the dialogue. They're very slow moving on ocean acidification, but it also is a possibility that joint actions of this kind can be bolted on to national contributions. So if there's a joint action by a number of states together, they could bolt those onto their nationally determined contributions. And we're looking at still the development of a mechanism under Article 6 of Paris, which is sort of like a trading mechanism. So that actually encourages the development of internationally transferable mitigation options, and also the development of projects which have mitigation benefits, which could also be tradable, if you like, but give access. The importance of that is it gives them access to new innovative financial mechanisms, which we're looking forward still to seeing the rules for. So I'm run out of time. I see that Sebastian's there, so thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I'm sorry it's right squeezed up at the end. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, David and Joanna. These are really very nice and complementary contributions to our discussion, and really to reassure you that this is only the start, and we are scratching the surface of really important topics, and in the course of the IOG forum we will come back to this in a minute to explain you the further process. We will dig really deep into such fundamental questions like the ones that David also just raised. And we have again got so many really good questions from our participants. And there's, for example, David, perhaps directly to you, a question from Teresa Molina, who works with the Spanish Fisheries Administration. And she, even before you made your contribution, raised the issues of RFMOs and how to, really engage them in the debate. How do you see a way to activate RFMOs on the one hand to address issues like also migrating fish stocks? How do we enable them to take these adaptation needs into account? But then also your point, how to increase resilience through MPA or through fishery closure creation. So David, and a very, very brief answer, please.
Yes, I'm hoping that this will be one method where we would actually increase this dialogue. This is one of the, I think that even I shouldn't say it quite like that, but even fisheries management organizations understand the impacts of climate change. So a method by which they could take group action in some way. I see that Takahiro has also raised that in relation to the work that UNEP are doing. It might be another mechanism for deepening those sorts of dialogues, which to our mutual benefit.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. And if we had more time, I would ask you a little bit more about your experience in the Sargasso Sea Commission in that regard. But this is perhaps really something that we can further also explore in the collaboration within the IOG forum. Joanna, we got another question by Mary Roberts, which I wanted to take out. And I mean, you have been working really hard to close the gap in the ocean and climate nexus, and you know about the difficulties in bringing together different regulatory regimes and stakeholders. So, I mean, there's also the science community taking very active role, of course, and they've created, as we all know, IPCC, but then also IPBES. So Mary asked, why not finding a way with regard to the oceans to have more joined up efforts in that regard? And I was wondering what your perspective is on that suggestion, which of course would have also quite strong policy implications.
Just a clarification, joined up efforts in terms of the assessment of the research, such as the IPCC and IPBES, or in terms of actual action?
About, of course, the research and the assessments.
I mean, we have one of the groups that I don't know we have online today, but we obviously work very closely with is IOC, who are leading all of the work on the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And as they also have a report on the state of ocean science, and very little money is spent on actual research and on the ocean, and systematic observation is a huge challenge also for many parts of the ocean, particularly in the Southern Ocean. So there's a big need to increase the emphasis on observation, increase the emphasis on research to support decision making. And the UN Decade certainly has a vision to do that and to provide the science we need for the ocean we want, to quote their vision. So that is happening now and will sort of hopefully happen over the next decade as that is widened. But of course, we need collaborators to do that. And the understanding from governments that the funding needs to be there, despite the challenges of funding research within EEZs across the open ocean and so on, and all of the legal issues that incorporates. So that is one challenge, of course. And as David said, it's not an easy one, and there are some options to address that. But I think that I think there's a lot of governance issues to really address in that area of how that joined up work can be better facilitated. And this has to be done through a governance frameworks. There's certainly obviously opportunities that parties can decide through multilateral mechanisms and the importance of linking up those different mechanisms as well. So there's a huge emphasis this year on biodiversity with the CBD, with the BBNJ and so on. And actually there's work under the UNFCCC also on biodiversity for resilience. So it's how we can try and find linkages and governance frameworks to work across those. But it's a challenge. It's not easy.
Thanks a lot, Joanna, for this contribution. And we will, as I said, we will all have a chance to deepen the debate. And Jean-Pierre, coming to you last, we have several questions that really perhaps prompted by your initial remark on the ocean, climate, and biodiversity nexus. Raised this point, and you also mentioned the Nature paper that you have put out, and in our discussion paper we also outline work that you have done on different policy options. So many of the mitigation options that are out there might, of course, have an effect again on biodiversity. Jake Rice also raised this point, like tidal and wave energy and these activities. So how can really governance help, and what are the approaches that can really help us to navigate through these possible trade-offs that we need to address in using the potential that we are really in the ocean when it comes to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, as you know, I'm not working on ocean governance, but I'll try to answer your question. In fact, I think many of those options are done nationally. I mean, windmills, wave energy collection, etc., is within national jurisdictions. As well as mitigating through blue carbon ecosystems, and there is a question about blue carbon. Why is it that the restoration is mostly focused on blue carbon systems? I think it is not. There is also blue carbon. There is also restoration in non-blue carbon ecosystems, such as oysters beds, and for example, in Scotland, there is a big project going on. Also in Chesapeake Bay, coral reefs also, which are not blue carbon systems. And the reason why there is so much emphasis on blue carbon is because it has, although in terms of mitigation, it has limited impact in the IPCC rock. We say that it is less than 2% of current emissions. So it's relatively small, but it has many co-benefits, such as coastal protection, acting on food security, and also maintaining biodiversity. So it's really a no-brainer, and that's why it's in the low regret option. In terms of governance, I'm not sure I can answer your question. In my view, it's mostly dealt with within nations. I'm not aware of international governance on, for example, renewable energy. Not aware of that, but perhaps someone else knows.
Well, thanks a lot, Jean-Pierre. And of course, we were mostly interested in your perspective as a scientist in this field. But as said earlier on, this is a discussion we will really continue to go much deeper into the topic. And with that, I really would like to thank our speaker and panelists on this third session here today. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, Joanna, David, for having such an early start in the morning. And please, all participants, please be with us for another couple of minutes. I'm really sorry that we're a little bit over time, but I hope this is understandable for all of you. So I won't, of course, now summarize all what has been said here. Please, if our panelists can switch off their cameras, that would be fantastic. But we got also quite a number of questions, for example, by Mentor Villa Gomez, who is the executive secretary of CPPS, already pointing at the question, how is the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the work that stakeholders, that policymakers and all of us are doing in this field, and that this will also need to be really considered in the future ocean governance processes that we are looking at. Others were also mentioning colleagues from fisheries organization, really highlighting that the plate is not empty, that a lot is out there, that RFMOs have in terms of protection of VMEs already done quite a lot. I think this very much also brings us back to the discussion we had earlier on interlinkages. So we'll take up all these questions that have come up in the further discussion. And in the closing of the session of our webinar, I would like to explain the way forward that we are seeing. We will have a recording of this webinar, and we would be really grateful if you help us in disseminating it, for example, through your social media channels. We will then, in the follow-up, in the months between May and July, we'll have topic-dedicated online workshops that will really go deep into those questions that we have discussed today, that we have outlined in the discussion paper. The debate today really has helped us to further validate the perspectives in the discussion paper and to review the issues and questions that we have put forward in the paper, and will facilitate a much more pointed discussion in these online workshops that will take place in a much smaller setting with invited experts. We will then have an online stakeholder-based consultation that will build on the discussions in the webinar or background paper and the dedicated online workshops, and all stakeholders that are registered, so basically all participants here in this call also are kindly invited to provide their views and to really provide input to the ongoing process. Next slide, please. We will then have, and this is was already mentioned by the Commissioner in the opening, the plan to hold an IOG Forum conference as an intermediary milestone to take place in December in Brussels, that will really bring forward the results from our working groups. And as mentioned earlier on, it's not only this one working group on improving the international ocean governance framework. There are two more on pressures on the ocean and on the science and ocean policy interface, and they have their starting webinars tomorrow and after tomorrow. Next slide, please. And then the ultimate aim is to present the outcome from all of this to a IOG Forum conference that is planned for spring 2029. And the ultimate aim, as was outlined by Director Veronika Feitz also in the opening, is to provide further input for the development of the EU's international ocean governance agenda and key action that the EU could do with regard to international ocean governance. But before handing over now to our co-chairs, Elise and Abar from the European External Action Service and to Mark Ritchie from DG Mare, please let me also thank you all for this exciting and really lively debate today. And I think it's really vital that we are all engaged in keeping the momentum for a healthy ocean. And we are really glad that we all came together here at home to share our expertise and to really engage in these important discussions. Finally, let me also thank our colleagues, Ben Boteler and Barbara Neumann, who were not really visible today, but were really instrumental in getting this all going and having a smooth operation in the background. And of course, to our colleagues from Action, from the European Marine Board and Fresh Thoughts, and of course from the European Commission, to giving us the opportunity to contribute to this important initiative. But now, without further ado, please let me hand over the floor to our co-chairs, to Elisane Abar and to Mark Ritchie. You have the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you to all. I'm very impressed by the quality and the level of contributions today. I would like to thank you all for this active participation in this webinar of the International Ocean Governance Forum, because this is really an innovative way and an interesting way nowadays to engage all together with the objective to address some of the challenges remaining in the oceans governance. I note a lot of excellent ideas and suggestions to go forward. I would like you to underline notably the importance of for all the levels of stakeholders, be it at local, regional, national, global levels, to work together in partnerships and to support also global solutions through the multilateral frameworks that we already have. I note also from our discussion the importance of monitoring the implementation of oceans commitments in all regions of the world, but also to support the capacity in the region where there is a lack of implementation. I note also that the importance of strengthening oceans diplomacy. As part of the External Action Service, I would like to say that we always suggest discussing oceans governance in all relevant political dialogues that we have with partner countries and with the regions. I think this contributes to sharing our objectives, our narratives, to try to include also all services and ministries in a more holistic approach, as we discussed today. and try to influence on the international scene. It's probably important now to use the European leverage to engage more actively in all the multilateral processes and negotiations that we have at the moment. We know that a lot of 2020 events have been now postponed. And of course, we can expect huge socioeconomic and social consequences due to the pandemic. But I think we should also sustain the momentum and the funding also for all the crucial regional and international processes which are related to ocean governance. It's a moment where probably the international community can realize where we have gaps, where we have weaknesses, regulatory or implementation gaps. And the pandemic is called also for the urgency to address threats to wildlife and ecosystems. And it's therefore important that we now insist on the recovery of the health crisis, that we also consider the environmental biodiversity dimensions as part of the global response to the pandemic. So this is really the only beginning of our public work in the frame of a forum. And I'd like to thank you all and thank also the team working on this webinar, the experts of the coordination. And I wish that we will continue working together in the next steps of the forum on concrete suggestions to improve international oceans governance. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisane. Mark, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. And what an amazing afternoon at the end, because while staying home, we contribute to improve ocean governance and in the same time to improve the quality of our climate. I think that if I judge by the number of participants still now and the number of questions which have been raised, I think we can say that COVID-19 and the confinement have not succeeded to break the momentum or to diminish the enthusiasm and the interest for those issues. I think on substance, the discussion was also very rich. There are a lot of ideas that have been presented, and of course, it might be frustrating for certain people to have just these ideas in the question and the answers, but be sure that we are going to look at that and going to assess that. I think on a personal basis that these ideas are really useful for answering key questions for international ocean governance. One of these questions is maybe related to the cross-sectoral dimension and the interlinkages we can make, or to shift from an approach which is essentially based on sectoral activities that are isolated towards a more integrated approach, which is more coordinated and which will lead to more relevance, more consistency, and more efficiency. So this is extremely important. I'm thinking about achieving the interlinkages between the various SDGs here, those which are ocean related, but also the others. The second important question we need to solve when it comes to international ocean governance, and I think that there were many interventions related to this when we spoke about the BPNJ and also the biodiversity framework, is the way to resolve these tensions which exist between conservation and use. And actually, although fisheries have been mentioned, this is not only these are not only tensions between fisheries and environment, but also between energy and tourism, for instance, and other uses of the sea and the oceans. And thirdly, at the time we begin to succeed to bring the ocean dimension in the climate discussion, I think it's also important to reflect how we can act to make these different dimensions mutually supportive and not that we act in this field to make them a competition between each other. So really trying to also work in complementarity. I will be really brief and hereby warmly congratulating also the participants, the speakers, the very good intervention, and also, of course, the team of our assistant mechanism led by Fresh Doubts, and in particular the IASS POSDAN that prepared and organized the today's session. It was very well done, I think, and it's not over, given that, as you said, we will have other webinars and then future consultation and the IOG forum at the end of the year. Thank you very much to all, and have an excellent end of afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and this brings the launching webinar to an end. So stay all safe. Be together at home and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.